Genetic identities are transmitted both through maternal and paternal roots. Maternal genetic identities are known as mtDNA haplogroups, which are transmitted from mother to both sons and daughters. On the other hand, the paternal genetic identities remain exclusively in the Y sex chromosome and transmitted from the father only to his son and not to his daughter. It is observed that R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome are two principal paternal genetic identities present in some parts of Eurasia and Northern African region. Tracing the presence of these two paternal genetic identities is essential to identify the direction of their spread in different parts of the world. It appears that these genetic identities originated during the last glacial period and their spread occurred during the last interglacial period starting from 12,000 years ago. Identification of the site of origin of the newer genetic identities like R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome is most crucial issue in order to understand the process of migration of the early human fraternities. These two newer genetic identities spread not only in the Eurasia region, but R1 bravo haplogroup also spread to Africa. As I have discussed in my book titled India in Egypt, several animal symbols were adopted by different ethnic fraternities as their ethnic identity. As they migrated from the east coast, they spread Indian languages to those distant lands. What was so special about the east coast of India, where all these ethnic fraternities developed? Is it possible that newer AMH fraternities like R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome originated in this region? Unless we are able to establish the unique nature of the Bengal-Myanmar coast to justify the origin of the newer genetic identities, the discussion regarding the migration of various ethnic fraternities from the east coast becomes baseless, and so will be the case regarding the spread of Indian languages. Interestingly, R1 alpha haplogroup in Y chromosome genetic identity is found in the entire Indo-European language-speaking territory, extending from Eastern India to Western Europe. Thus, this entire territory is clearly linguistically and genetically continuous. Europe has high percentage of R1 bravo haplogroup in Y chromosome genetic identity. This genetic identity is also found in various other regions of Asia including India and Mesopotamia, and also in the Afro-Asian speaking Central Africa. Presently, it is believed that R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome both originated in Eastern Europe near the European steppe and Anatolia region. Whereas it appears that a unique geophysical phenomena which took place on the east coast of India during the last glacial period is responsible for the origin of these two newer genetic identities in that region. It is extremely crucial to establish the site of origin of R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome on the Bengal glacial coastal shelf during the last glacial period. That would provide us the direction of the migration of the post-glacial period anatomically modern human fraternities from east to west, which started 12,000 years ago. This would also justify the spread of Indian languages and culture to distant lands. A number of Aboriginal tribes live in the Andaman archipelago. However, there is very little discussion about who were these people, when and how did they reach there. The only probable explanation is that they walked into the Andaman archipelago from the Bengal-Myanmar coast when a land bridge formed. During the glacial maximum, the sea level subsides by about 400 feet or 130 meters, and the Bengal coastline recedes connecting Andamans with the mainland. In the physical map of India, we find the Bay of Bengal region having a very shallow depth. During the last glacial period, for several thousand years, a huge coastal landmass surfaced between the Bengal and Myanmar coast, which is referred to as the Bengal Glacial Coastal Shelf in this book. During this time, the population of two distinct genetic territories, the east coast of India and Southeast Asia, intermixed. and this genetic union produced newer genetic identities like R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome. As the seawater gradually rose during the interglacial period, this coastal landmass submerged, displacing the settled population. They settled on the Bengal coast and adopted various animal symbols as mentioned before as their ethnic identity. To begin with, they were bare-bodied and were known as Naga, popularly known as Nanga in Hindi, who adopted the Naga or serpent as their ethnic symbol. It is possible that their mother goddess was Kali, who is also depicted bare-bodied. Some of these early fraternities eventually migrated following the trans-Himalayan migration routes pivoting Mount Kailash. The Indus Valley civilization emerged on this route. They continued their journey and established the Egyptian and Greek civilizations. For this reason, we find R1 bravo reaching Mediterranean coast, Afro-Asian speaking Africa and also in Western Europe. Now let us discuss the present view regarding the identification of the site of origin of R1 bravo and R1 alpha haplogroups. This is the present map available regarding the distribution of R1 bravo haplogroup in the Y chromosome in the world. R1 bravo haplogroup is found in Europe, Middle East, Northern Africa and in scattered form in Asia. It is observed that though the concentration of R1 bravo is much more in Western Europe, European steppe located in extreme Eastern Europe is considered as its site of origin, considering that older divisions of R1 bravo are found in the east. But in spite of having several pockets of R1 bravo farther east and on the Bengal coast, any eastern location as the probable site of origin of R1 bravo haplogroup is never considered. Interestingly, several pockets of RPH 155, which is commonly known as R1 bravo 1 bravo, are found in isolated locations, for example in Bhutan, Ladakh, Xinjiang province of western China north of Ladakh, Yunnan province of southern China close to northeast India, Tajikistan, Turkey and Bahrain. Scholars admit that the presence of these pockets is difficult to explain if the origin of R1 bravo haplogroup is considered to be the European steppe. Moreover, there is no linguistic continuity between European steppe and Afro-Asian speaking Africa where R1 bravo is present. Thus, there are several unsolved puzzles which create obstacles to accept the European steppe as the site of origin of R1 bravo haplogroup. Genetic studies involving European population had started a couple of decades ago. Hence, more genetic data of that region are now available. As other territories got included in the genetic studies, unusual R1 bravo pockets emerged which further complicated the issue. Indian population have been included in the genetic studies comparatively recently. In the recent studies published by the global scholars, a few pockets of R1 bravo have emerged in India which demands a serious attention. Interestingly, an isolated pocket of R1 bravo genetic identity is found on the east coast of India, which has not received the required attention so far. Kivisil study conducted in 2003 shows that 6.5% population of West Bengal have R1 bravo, which is quite significant. These isolated pockets need to be included while charting the early migration paths of the fraternity. In fact, it is even possible that this pocket is the oldest settlement of the R1 bravo genetic identity from where earliest migration of R1 bravo started. Once we arrange the migration path of R1 bravo originating from the Bengal coast, all other pockets of R1 bravo, including the isolated pocket of Bahrain, could be connected along the two continuous migration paths. Now let us discuss the present view regarding the origin of the R1 alpha haplogroup in Y chromosome, which is exclusively found in the Indo-European speaking territory. Underhill and his team published a number of papers following their periodic studies on the subject. His map on the origin of R1 alpha also suggested that it originated in the Anatolia and European steppe region. However, the map drawn on the basis of a recent study by the same team confirmed that a pocket of oldest R1 alpha haplogroup is found in western India near Gujarat, and two pockets of high concentration of R1 alpha zone are found in the Himalayan region. Many scholars thus feel that the site of origin of R1 alpha haplogroup in South Asia cannot be ruled out. Though in this map, Bengal is not shown as one of the important sites harboring R1 alpha in the region, almost all the studies, including Underhill studies, have confirmed that R1 alpha is found in significant number in West Bengal. In fact, as per the study by Sharma in 2009, 72% of the Brahmin population of West Bengal has R1 alpha haplogroup, one of the highest percentage of R1 alpha in the world. Moreover, Bengali language not only belongs to the Indo-European language branch, but it has a significant component of Sanskrit and Prakrito, two of the oldest languages of the group. It is much easier to detect a pocket of early genetic fraternities in a remote region where the population remained relatively undisturbed, like in the Himalayan region and Gujarat. On the other hand, it is extremely difficult to locate a pocket of early R1 alpha in Bengal, as this region received a number of reverse migration fraternities over millennia till a recent period from different directions. Thus, Bengal is expected to have the most complex form of genetic admixture, posing a challenge for the geneticist to analyze its composition. It is interesting to observe that Bengal region not only has a linguistic continuity with Europe as Indo-European speakers, but it also has genetic continuity with Europe, where R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome are primary genetic identities. It is likely that a very early migration of post-glacial period anatomically modern humans or AMH fraternities like R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome had taken place from India to the west with their language and culture. The distribution of the R1 bravo haplogroups detected all over the world has a striking similarity with the migration path of the R1 bravo haplogroup proposed in this book. They originated on the Bengal coastal shelf and migrated along the Himalayan rivers as their settlements submerged at the onset of the interglacial period. As they reached the junction at Mount Kailash, they followed two distinct routes. One route descended along River Indus and followed Makran coast to reach Central Africa, entering the continent through the Horn of Africa. In this way, R1 bravo haplogroup reached Bahrain on this path. The other route from Mount Kailash reached Europe through Anatolia or Turkey and European steppe. This migration started 10,000 years ago or before, at the onset of the interglacial period, more specifically during the meltwater pulse 1b of the interglacial period. Similarly, about 5,800 years ago, as the settlements of the R1 alpha submerged on the Bengal coast during the meltwater pulse 1c of the interglacial period, another wave of migration started. They also followed the Himalayan rivers from Bengal coast to reach Mount Kailash and divided into two branches. One branch descended along the Indus to Gujarat and Balochistan, where an old division of R1 alpha was detected by the Underhill genetic study team. The other branch from Mount Kailash reached Eastern Europe, entering the continent through Anatolia and European steppe. Thus, we find another old division of R1 alpha detected by the Underhill team in that region. According to a 2014 study by Underhill, R1 alpha M417 divided into two lineages, Z93 and Z282, about 5,800 years ago. Z93 is more common in Indian subcontinent, while Z282 is in Europe. This suggests that these two lineages dissociated 5,800 years ago, when R1 alpha spread from India to Eastern Europe across the Himalayas, and these two lineages flourished in their respective territories. Both the R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups from India entered Europe through the European steppe and Anatolia or modern-day Turkey, and hence this region possesses oldest division of both these genetic identities found within Europe. This region thus erroneously appears to be the site of origin of both these genetic identities. 10,000 years ago, R1 bravo spread to Mediterranean coast, Egypt and Africa with Pali and Prakrito languages. On the other hand, 5800 years ago, R1 Alpha spread to Eastern Europe with spoken Sanskrit language. It is important that we understand that both R1 Alpha and R1 Bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome originated on the east coast of India, and from there they spread along with their language and cultural characteristics. Only then the archaeological, linguistic and cultural elements of India found all over Eurasia and Africa, especially in Egypt, would be much easier to appreciate. The Egyptian civilization, one of the oldest civilizations which emerged in Africa, was possibly developed by the people who had come from India with their language and culture. In fact, as we arrange the migration path of early genetic identities originating from India, a very interesting observation emerges. All the ancient civilizations like the Indus Valley civilization, Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Egyptian and Greek civilization can be found along the two migration paths originating from India. European territory can be compared with a jar with its opening towards the European steppe and Anatolia on the east. During the last interglacial period, newer genetic identities like the R1 Alpha and R1 Bravo haplogroups entered Europe through descent, starting from 8000 years ago. During this time, agriculture also entered Europe through Anatolia or modern-day Turkey. The Proto-Indo-European language possibly entered Europe around 5800 years ago along with the R1 Alpha haplogroup in the Y chromosome. On the purely genetic front, it appears that the R1 Bravo haplogroup in Y chromosome reached Europe around 8000 years ago. They reached in good number as the Trans-Himalayan migration path pivoting Mount Kailash opened. At a later date, around 5800 years ago, R1 Alpha haplogroup arrived in Europe along with their spoken Sanskrit language. As they reached Europe from the east, they pushed the R1 Bravo haplogroup in Y chromosome more towards the west. So today we find R1 Bravo concentration more towards Western Europe as this R1 Bravo distribution map suggests. However, interestingly, it has been found that older branches of R1 Bravo haplogroups are found towards the east near the European steppe as they had entered through Europe through this route. On the other hand, as the R1 Alpha haplogroup arrived later from the east, we find their concentration more towards Eastern Europe as this R1 Alpha distribution map portrays R1 Alpha haplogroup in Y chromosome also introduced spoken Sanskrit which served as the Proto-Indo-European language. The phenomena of the reverse migration of these Indian origin fraternities back to India is now referred to as the Indo-Aryan invasion. It appears that the R1 Bravo haplogroup spread from India during the first wave of migration which reached Mediterranean coast, Egypt and Afro-Asian speaking Africa. From these regions, I found another interesting axis along which R1 Bravo haplogroup reached Western Europe directly across the Mediterranean Sea. Along with them, Indian language and culture must have reached Western Europe pretty early. We find a territory called Basque in France and Spain with a different culture and language. Interestingly, Basque language does not belong to the Indo-European branch and hence it is considered as one of the lingua isolate. Obviously, this culture and language must have arrived here much before the European culture and Indo-European language reached this region. Archaeologically also, we find spread of bell beaker culture along this route reaching Western Europe which lasted from 2800 BC to 1800 BC. Coincidentally, as the Indian origin people started migrating from this region back to India, this form of art disappeared from Europe. Curiously, this reverse migration phenomena coincides with the collapse of several ancient civilizations of the world. The Indian origin people approached Europe from two directions. One group entered via Turkey and European steppe, while the other directly reached Western Europe across the Mediterranean Sea. As a result, we find different pockets of bell beaker culture in Europe. Moreover, as it was carried by the Indian origin people, this culture was found associated with both R1 Bravo and R1 Alpha haplogroups, but more with the first. Intriguingly, the shape of this bell beaker is still quite popular among the artisans of India. At this juncture, there is a definite need to search for the source from where these R1 Bravo and R1 Alpha haplogroups in Y chromosome were spreading with their refined languages and advanced skills. This search is likely to lead you to the east coast of India. It is high time that we acknowledge that there was a refined civilization existing beyond Europe on its east since a very early period, and possibly since the last glacial period. Interestingly, a number of archaeological sites have been discovered recently beyond Europe on the east, which suggests the direction of arrival of the fraternities with advanced knowledge and skill. The location of Göbekli Tepe and Jericho in southeast Turkey and around suggests their arrival from the east. These sites were created 12,000 years ago. The structure found there suggests that they were created by a refined fraternity and not by the primitive hunter-gatherers. It is time that we extended our vision farther east in search of the source of such advanced skill and knowledge. Recent discovery of large archaeological sites at the Gulf of Kambat Cultural Complex, Mehrgarh, Rakhigarhi, Virana, Kalibangan and so on establishes the route as they are all located on the migration path from eastern India to the Mediterranean coast as suggested in this book. These settlements have all been detected to have existed since around 10,000 years ago. They are clearly much older than whatever has been discovered in entire Europe so far. It appears that a refined civilization had developed on the east coast of India during the last glacial period. There is one more important issue which needs to be settled regarding the site of origin of the newer genetic identities like the R1 alpha and R1 Bravo haplogroups in the Y chromosome. It has been estimated that these genetic identities originated around 25,000 years ago. We find archaeological sites of Europe are only 9,000 years old. If we stick to the present view that these newer genetic identities originated in the European steppe and Anatolia, then it becomes difficult to explain this period gap where they took 16,000 years to reach rest of Europe from European steppe. Moreover, archaeological sites of Göbekli Tepe and Natufian culture have emerged in the meantime, which are 12 to 14,000 years old and are located in the southeast Turkey and on the Mediterranean coast, much to the east of Europe. In this case also, they took 10,000 years to reach eastern Mediterranean coast from their site of origin in the European steppe. Thus, these recent findings do not match with the period of origin of the newer genetic identities and their direction of movement. On the other hand, it is possible that these newer genetic identities originated on the Bengal coast during the last glacial period when the coastal landmass emerged around 25,000 years ago. They migrated only when their settlements started submerging around 12 to 14,000 years ago at the onset of the interglacial period. On their way to the Mediterranean coast and Europe, they established Gulf of Kambat Cultural Complex, Mehrgarh, Natufian culture, Göbekli Tepe and settled in similar other ancient sites. Thereafter, they reached Anatolia and European steppe to enter Europe. If we consider this view, then the present genetic observations and archaeological findings match in a more acceptable manner. India needs a special attention of the global scholars to understand the process of early migration of anatomically modern humans all over the major parts of the world.